Hey guys, Brent Hull Build Show, talking today about tapered columns, why they're so important, and how we learn from the past to make better things today. Come join me. Columns, okay, and even though they're tapered columns, the magic of columns, okay, and the proportioning and scale tool that columns are is still important. So we're going to look at the past and how they did this, but remember that in 1920, 1910, when they were building columns, they were still part of the classical tradition. That means there is a human scale and a human form to columns that was very important. There's at least 3 details that you need to get right when you're doing these historic columns. We're going to break that out as we talk about tapered columns because all those things still matter. All right, so look at these houses, right? There's a collection of bungalow houses here. They have this very strong column, very strong brick column, a very beefy cap that goes on that column, and then a tapered column that goes up. Now sometimes those tapered columns are very short, very decorative. They break down, they go right down to the neck of the beam. Sometimes they're quite large, sometimes they're paneled, sometimes they're decorated, right? There's a lot of details going on. What I did was I went by this house, I noticed it was under construction, so I got out and I measured. And one of the best ways to figure out how things were built is to get a tape measure out and actually draw it with your hands. You look at it and you remember it in your mind, but unless you get out and sketch it, it's really difficult to understand what these dimensions and details are. This happened to me one time when I was doing a neo-craftsman house, and I remember the cap that we ended up putting on top of our little pedestal was like 2.5 inches. And then when we put it in there and we walked away and we looked back and go, ugh, that's way too thin. And I hadn't realized how big those caps really are until I went back and measured. And so I realized that they're sometimes 5 inches. Just picture yourself in front of this house and look at these brick columns. Look at this, look at the wood column above. How big is that brick column, right? Is it 30 inches? Is it 18 inches? Is it 25 inches? What is it, right? How thick is that cap on top there? How tall is that column? What are the dimensions of those moldings on those columns, right? All of these questions that if you're going to build it, if you're going to actually put this together on your project, you really need to understand. I had to get out and measure it, and it wasn't until I got out and measured that I realized the mass and the scale of this thing and what was going on. For instance, that column is 25 inches wide, right? There's a trick here that I was using later. Most houses built in the 1920s use common brick, okay? A common brick is an 8-inch long, 2 inches tall, 4 inches wide, right? So I could actually measure off those bricks there. There was 3 courses of bricks going across in that column, 25 inches wide. I'm going, okay, now I kind of got a sense of scale of this thing. And then you go, that cap is 5 inches wide. Wow, that's 5 inches thick. That's really big. So I'm breaking all of these things down, guys, trying to get it in my head and building it in my head as I'm sketching, as I'm measuring, getting a new sense of scale. Now, the first trick in kind of getting these details right is really understanding and being students of the past, right? Looking at the past carefully, and by carefully I mean getting out, measuring it, sketching it, looking at it so that you can understand how to do it right today. There's 3 details I want to focus on. One is the connection of the neck of the column, that's the top little part of the column, to the beam. Now I've explained before, guys, there's the beam that comes down that is supporting. And remember, this goes all back to that classical architecture with the entablature and everything else. So in classical architecture, you have, you know, your column, and then you have a beam that it supports. And the first part's the architrave, the second part's the frieze, and then you get a cornice, right? So you've got these different parts and pieces here, right? Same thing is true here on these columns. And one of the things that you'll notice here is that the neck of the column, right, this part right here, always lines up with the width of the beam in the entablature, okay? So those 2 dimensions are the same. They work together. It helps your eye go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. If you had a column and the beam was like this, okay, that would convey that the column isn't big enough to support the beam above it. And yet what happens here in classical architecture is that detail makes us feel like, okay, yeah, that column definitely has the strength and the ability to support that, you know, house above it. Now, we're getting into some of that with our columns, but you'll notice on the houses that we're looking at, almost always with these tapered columns, there is a connection where the neck of the column, okay, and the beam above are the same width. That is a really key detail. I get pushback from you guys about it from time to time, but please trust me, that is a really important detail that you'll see on all these historic houses. There is an entablature, okay? And you'll see on these things that there is a beam that goes across. And so if I'm in the porch and my big pier's out here, right? I've got a small tapered column, right, that goes across here. There is a beam that comes down that's supporting that roof, okay? Now you'll see in a lot of new houses, they have the roof come right down on top of the column, and that doesn't look very good. And so your beadboard roof is up here, your porch ceiling here, and there's a definite beam that comes down that's supported there. So that connection, number one, that connection between the neck of the column and the beam that's supporting the porch is really important. Two, there is a sense of scale with all of these things. And one of the reasons you can drive up to the house and go, ooh, that looks too skinny, right? Is because we naturally understand that sense of scale. I've found that there's like 3 categories of columns on these historic bungalows, right? There is the straight pier, right, which is the brick column that goes up and the roof setting right down on top of it. The other kind you see is the short pedestal, right, which we've talked about, and there's a tapered column that goes up. And then the third type is the pier that goes up about this far, and then there's a very quickly tapered column that goes up, right? There's 3 kinds of things that are most predominant. The bungalow story, okay, the bungalow philosophy is one of strength, okay, one of heft, okay? My wife doesn't love the craftsman style houses because they're too masculine, okay? Well, what do you mean they're masculine? Sometimes they're dark, right? The stained wood's inside, but they're also beefy. They're not dainty. And so none of these collection of columns are dainty. And so they have a scale, they have a size, right? That gives them this heft and this strength. Number 3 is the story, right? That there is a philosophy, that there is a story that the homes are trying to communicate, that they're very casual, that they are very comfortable to live in, that they're not heavily ornamented, right? And so there is a narrative to the arts and crafts style that's important, that all the parts and pieces communicate that, right? We don't have an Ionic capital, for instance. We don't have a Corinthian capital. We don't have egg and dart and carved moldings, right? I think this all comes together as we look at new examples and kind of what's wrong. So what we have on this porch is a tapered column, right, on a rusticated base. That's appropriate, right? The problem is that my column is actually coming out here, okay, and tapering up. Now, what that means is that this base, okay, doesn't seem to support this as well. In classical architecture, in good design, okay, you'll see stronger things supporting weaker things. This one could have been improved by just adding a cap in there and shrinking that column so it's not engulfing or swallowing the stone below, but it's actually supported very prettily. Also notice in this one that there really isn't a strong beam connection, right? In this case, I probably would have shrunk the columns down a little bit, dropped my beam down so that the connection and pieces of all this thing would have worked better. This one isn't terrible, right? I like the height of the pedestal. I like the scale and the pieces. The problem is this whole beam and header connection is messed up in that we've got a very strong pediment coming down on these 2 weaker columns, and it doesn't look like visually like these columns can support this heavy pediment that's sitting over top of it. The pediment should have been lightened. Just visually, just the drive-by, just looking at it, it makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable about going up to that doorway because the pediment is so big, right? We're like, am I safe under there? Now, this could have been lightened up a number of ways. One is it could have been shrunk in size so that if this did come up, right, if this did have a beam in here, something that supports that, it could have been less massive, okay? 2, you can actually take this and just hollow this out, right? You could put an arch in type here so that it wasn't quite as heavy. You could have taken the tympanum, which we'll talk about in another video, which is the inside of your pediment, and lightened it up with a window, lightened it up with some stained glass, lightened it up with a vent, right? Something that punctures that mass, right, and helps us to see it better. Last one, this is a tapered columns, but you know, this is one of those houses that it doesn't really need tapered columns. It looks like they want a classical column, but they decided on tapered columns. the pedestal's too high, right? The pedestal, the proportion of the pedestal to the column is almost half. And so if you're gonna do this porch going across, if this is my porch, when your pedestal goes up, this far, your porch column is like this. Remember, the pedestal is a punctuation, right? It's a 1 to 5, 1 to 4 relationship. And so this pedestal needs to be down here, okay? Second of all, those pedestals are really tall to be supporting a tapered column like it's showing. You're combining styles here. You're combining those narratives and those stories, and it's kind of confusing for the eye, right? You're like, what exactly am I looking at? The pedestal is kind of a classical pedestal, but you have this arts and craft tapered column. Every part and piece of your house should communicate this deal. And one of the arts and crafts things does so well is they look very strong. They look very confident because their columns are really big and you don't question whether things can be carried. All those parts and pieces are saying the same narrative and saying the same story. Okay guys, so tapered columns, right? We see them a lot. Hopefully now after watching this video, you know that you can go to the past, you can look back, go measure some things in your historic neighborhoods and actually get really good ideas. And when you remember all these different things, hopefully your tapered columns will turn out much better. Be sure to follow me on Instagram and Facebook, Hull Millwork, Hull Homes. Sign up for the newsletter. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. I'm Brent Hull. Thanks for watching.